She handed me a printed document the first time I tried to hold my grandson, and I want you to understand what I mean by that. Not a note, not a list on a napkin, not a quick reminder about allergies. A printed, double-sided document with section headers and bullet points slid across the kitchen island like we were closing on real estate. I had driven 2.5 hours from Knoxville to Nashville with a stuffed elephant under my arm, gray, with a yellow bow tie, because my wife Carol always said elephants were good luck for babies. My daughter-in-law, Daphne, met me at the door. She smiled the way she always smiled, warm enough on the surface, but with something underneath that never quite settled. She handed me the paper before I'd even put down my keys. "Just so we have everything clear," she said. My son Adrian was somewhere behind her. I could hear him in the kitchen, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. He didn't come out right away. I read the document standing in their foyer. No unannounced visits. Contact to be scheduled at least 72 hours in advance via text only. No bringing outside food. No photographing Jonah without prior consent. Visits limited to 2 hours on alternating Saturdays, between 10 a.m. and noon. Gifts to be pre-approved by Daphne. At the bottom, there was a line for my signature. I looked at her. She looked back at me with that same surface-level smile. I didn't sign it. My name is Silas Pruett. I'm 58 years old. I spent 29 years running a general contracting business out of Knoxville. Residential work mostly, the occasional commercial job. I built things that were meant to stand. I retired early when Carol got sick 4 years ago now, and I don't regret a single day of that decision. Carol was the kind of woman who knew the name of every waitress at every diner we went to regularly. She sent birthday cards by hand even to distant cousins she hadn't seen in a decade. She once reorganized the entire baking cabinet at my mother's house without being asked, just because she could see it was bothering my mother. And my mother was too proud to say so. She had a gift for noticing what people needed before they said it out loud. She loved our son fiercely. She adored Jonah from the moment she knew he existed. She cried when Adrian called to tell us Daphne was pregnant, the good kind of crying, the kind that doesn't need an explanation. Carol died 2.5 years ago, ovarian cancer. 11 months from the first real symptom to the last day. She held Jonah twice. Once in the hospital the week he was born, and once at Christmas when he was 4 months old and already reaching for things with those small determined fists. She used to say that getting to meet him was the part she was most grateful for, that she could leave knowing who came next. After she died, the silence in the house took some getting used to, but that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing the family I thought I had was slowly being rearranged around me, one rule at a time. It hadn't started with the document. It had started earlier, in smaller ways, the kind you notice but don't name for a long time because naming them would mean accepting something you're not ready to accept. Daphne had always been particular, organized, careful, private. I didn't have a problem with that. Adrian had chosen her, and Carol and I both genuinely liked her in those early years. She was sharp, good at her job. She worked in hospital administration, and she clearly ran their household with a level of efficiency that Adrian, who had never once filed anything on time before he met her, seemed to genuinely appreciate. But after Jonah was born, something shifted. Or maybe it had been shifting before that, and I only started seeing it clearly, once Carol wasn't there to smooth things over. The visits got harder to schedule. The 72-hour notice rule, which hadn't been written down at that point, started being enforced in practice. Once I drove up on a Thursday, because Adrian had specifically asked me to, and Daphne met me at the door and said she didn't think this was going to work, that Jonah was fussy and she didn't want him overstimulated. I stood on the porch for 6 minutes and then drove home. I mentioned it to Adrian the next time we talked. He said, "You know how she is about his schedule." I did know. What I was beginning to understand was that knowing how she was and being able to do anything about it were two entirely different things. Then the document. I didn't sign it, but I didn't argue about it either. I smiled and said I'd look it over, then went inside and held Jonah on the couch and read him the book I'd brought, and I acted like the piece of paper in my jacket pocket was not the most bizarre thing that had happened to me in 2 years. Adrian sat across from us in the armchair and watched. He looked, then, exactly like a man who has been coached on what to say if something goes wrong and is relieved that nothing has. Over the next several months, I followed every rule. I scheduled visits 72 hours out by text. I came on the alternating Saturdays, 10 to noon. I left on time. I didn't bring food. I didn't take pictures without asking. I swallowed every instinct I had to just be a grandfather, to show up with a bag of groceries, to take Jonah to the park down the street, to be the kind of presence I'd had in my own life from my grandfather, who never once needed an appointment. But the rules kept adjusting. Alternating Saturdays became first and third Saturdays only, because Daphne said Jonah needed consistency. Then visits moved to 90 minutes, because she felt 2 hours was too long for a toddler to maintain a meaningful connection with any single person. I wasn't allowed to pick Jonah up from daycare, even when Daphne was running late and Adrian called to ask, because she said later that wasn't an approved contact situation. I drove 1 hour and 40 minutes each way, every first and third Saturday, to sit in their living room for 90 minutes. Then Daphne called me. She was pleasant about it, the way she always was. Polite, organized, with the warmth of someone who has prepared the conversation in advance. She said she'd been thinking about Jonah's future, about the costs of raising a child, about how she and Adrian were stretched thin. She framed it carefully, like a business proposal. A monthly contribution, she said. Not a big ask. Just something to show I was invested in Jonah's well-being in a tangible way. $750 a month, transferred directly to an account she controlled, for access to my grandson. She called it a family support fund. I said I'd need to think about it. She said, "Of course, take your time," and there was something in her voice that told me she had expected exactly that response, and had already planned for it. I drove home in the particular kind of quiet that isn't restful. It's the quiet of a man trying very hard to keep hold of himself. That night I sat at the kitchen table, where Carol and I had drunk our morning coffee for 22 years, and I thought for a long time. I thought about Jonah's laugh, this surprised, delighted sound he makes when something catches him off guard, a sound Carol would have recognized in her sleep. I thought about the document in the foyer, about the 90-minute visits, about how my own grandfather had shown up every Sunday with a bag of peaches from his garden, and nobody in our family had ever once thought to hand him a piece of paper about it. I thought about a conversation I'd had with my neighbor Gloria about 8 months earlier, when her daughter was going through a custody dispute. She had mentioned a family law attorney in Knoxville, a man named Edmund Hart, who she described as the kind of lawyer who listens before he talks, and doesn't get loud when things get complicated. She had given me his card. I had kept it in the kitchen drawer without ever being fully sure why. I took it out that night. I called Edmund Hart's office the next morning. He picked up himself. I spent about 40 minutes explaining the situation as clearly as I could. The document, the rules, the escalating restrictions, the money demand. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked a few careful questions. When had I given them money? How much and what for? Was there documentation? I told him. I had given Adrian and Daphne $55,000 3 years ago, when they bought their house in the Bellevue neighborhood of Nashville. It was the bulk of an inheritance from my father, and I had transferred it via wire with a memo line that read gift. Home purchase. I had a copy of the wire confirmation. I had the original bank statement. Edmund said that was good. He also said that under Tennessee law, grandparents can petition the court for visitation when access has been unreasonably withheld, particularly when the grandparent has had a significant prior relationship with the child. He cited Tennessee Code Annotated, Section 36-6306. He said he'd want to understand the full financial picture before we decided how to proceed. He told me to save every text, every email, every document Daphne had sent me. He told me to write down, with dates, every visit that had been restricted or canceled, and he told me to talk to my accountant. I had used the same accountant for 17 years, a meticulous, methodical man named Gerald Fairborn, who had done my business taxes since I first incorporated, and who kept records the way some people keep family photographs, organized, annotated, and permanent. I called Gerald that same afternoon. What Gerald found didn't come from Daphne's private accounts. I want to be clear about this because the credibility of what happened next matters, and it matters a great deal. Gerald pulled my records, the wire confirmation, the bank statement, the memo line. The $55,000 had gone from my account to their joint checking in one clean transfer. My side of the transaction was documented completely. The rest of it came from Adrian. About a week into the process, I asked my son if we could have coffee. Not to tell him anything yet, just to see him. We met at a Cracker Barrel, off I-40, about halfway between Knoxville and Nashville. And we sat across from each other in a booth, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long while and didn't know how to put it down. I didn't push. I asked him how he was doing. He said fine. He asked me how I was doing. I said fine. And then, without me asking anything about money, he said, quietly, staring at his coffee, that he had been going through their joint account statements the previous week, trying to track down a billing error from the HOA, and he had noticed transfers he didn't recognize, regular amounts, moved out to an account he had no information on. He said he'd asked Daphne about it. She told him it was a savings account for Jonah that she was setting up properly before she mentioned it. He said he wasn't sure he believed her. I said, "Son, I need you to send me those statements." He looked at me across the table for a long moment. Then he said, "I already saved them." Gerald and Edmund worked together over the following 5 weeks. The statements Adrian had pulled showed a consistent pattern, transfers of $200 to $300 at a time, small enough individually to avoid easy notice, but adding up. The account they went to was in Daphne's name alone, opened about 14 months after they bought the house. Over roughly 18 months, close to $19,000 had moved through the joint account into that separate account. Whether any of it traced directly to my $55,000 was difficult to establish with certainty. Money in a joint account loses its source identity quickly, but Edmund said the pattern, the timing, and the documentation of my original gift told a clear enough story for the purposes of a legal demand letter. He drafted 2 documents. The first was a formal letter invoking Tennessee's grandparent visitation statute, noting that I had maintained a consistent and meaningful relationship with Jonah from birth, that the relationship was documented through visit logs and text records, and that the restrictions had escalated to a point that met the legal threshold for a court petition. The second document was a financial summary, my transfer, the memo line, the date, the amount, the joint account statements, and the transfers to the separate account. A clean, factual picture, prepared and signed by Gerald. I put both documents in a manila envelope. I called Adrian and told him I wanted to come for my regular Saturday visit. He said that was fine. He sounded tired in a specific way I recognized. Not the tired of a busy week, but the tired of someone who has been thinking hard about something they can't stop thinking about. I drove to Nashville on a morning in early October. The hills along I-40 were starting to turn. The envelope was on the passenger seat. I had it paper-clipped shut, which was unnecessary, but it felt right. Daphne answered the door. She was wearing the careful, prepared expression she always wore when I arrived. Pleasant in the technical sense, the kind of pleasantness that requires effort to maintain. Jonah was somewhere in the back of the house. I could hear him talking to himself, the particular murmur of a 4-year-old narrating his own game. I told her I had something I needed to give Adrian. She started to say something about how he was in the middle of something, that maybe another time would be better. I said gently that it would only take a moment, and that I was happy to wait. She got him. Adrian came to the door. He saw the envelope. His expression changed in a way I recognized, not fear, not guilt exactly, but the look of a person who has been waiting for something they knew was coming and still isn't prepared for the actual moment. I handed him the envelope. He opened it there in the doorway, with Daphne a half step behind his shoulder. He read the first page. His jaw tightened. He read the second page. His face moved through several expressions in about 30 seconds. Confusion, then something harder, then a long stillness that had the quality of a man setting something down he'd been holding for too long. He looked up at me. He said, "Dad, what is this?" I said, "It's a letter from my attorney, and a financial summary from my accountant. I think you already know most of what's in the second document. I think that's why you saved those statements." Daphne said, "I don't know what he's told you." I said quietly, "The accounts are documented, the transfers are documented, all of it." I wasn't angry when I said it. I want to be clear about that. I was calm in the specific way you get calm when you've had 5 weeks to sit with something and have already decided, before you ever walked up those porch steps, how this was going to go. Not vindictive, not triumphant, just finished with pretending. I said, "This isn't about creating a crisis. It's about two things. My son deserves to know what's been happening in his own finances, and I deserve to be in my grandson's life without being charged for it." Jonah appeared around Adrian's leg then, the way small children do, sudden, unhurried, completely indifferent to whatever the adults around him were feeling. He looked up at me. "Pop," he said. "That's what he calls me." I crouched down. "Hey, buddy." He held up a plastic dinosaur. "It's a brachiosaurus," he said, with the full authority of a 4-year-old who has recently learned a word and intends to use it at every opportunity. "I know," I said. "That's a good one." We sat at their kitchen table for almost 3 hours that afternoon. Jonah played in the next room. The conversation was not easy, but it was honest, which was something the three of us hadn't managed in a long time. Daphne tried at first to explain the transfers. The account was for household management, for a rainy day fund, for expenses that were hard to plan for. But the documentation was specific, and the pattern was clear, and at a certain point she stopped explaining. She sat very still and very quiet, which is what happens when a person runs out of a story. Adrian called Edmund 2 weeks later. Not as an adversary, as someone who needed to understand his own situation clearly. Edmund answered his questions and referred him to a colleague who could advise him independently, which I had asked Edmund to be prepared to offer. What happened after that is my son's story to tell, not mine. I'll only say that it was hard, and slower than I expected, and that I tried to be present without pushing. They separated for about 4 months. Daphne moved in with her sister in Memphis for a while. Adrian and Jonah were alone in the house in Nashville, and I drove up twice a week during that stretch without anyone asking me to, because there was a small boy who needed his grandfather and a son who needed his father. They reconciled eventually, which surprised some people, and didn't surprise me. I had never wanted the marriage to end. I had wanted the dynamic inside it to change. Whether it did, in any lasting way, is something only they can answer. What I know is that the financial situation was addressed as part of a formal agreement they reached with the help of 2 separate attorneys. And my $55,000 was acknowledged in writing as a gift, from which a portion had been redirected without disclosure. Some of it was repaid. Some was left as a loss. Edmund told me pursuing the full amount wasn't worth the cost in time and damage, and I agreed. Some things settle for less than you put in. That's true of more than money. The last thing I want to say, and I'll say it plainly, because I think it matters, is that what happened to me has a name. It's called financial coercion combined with access restriction, and it happens to grandparents more often than most people want to admit. The mechanism is almost always the same. The person on the receiving end is usually someone who doesn't want conflict, who trusts their family, who believes that patience and goodwill will eventually be enough. They absorb a great deal before they understand what is actually being done to them. I'm not a confrontational man. I spent nearly 30 years in contracting, which meant 30 years of solving problems before they became crises, of checking load-bearing elements, of making sure structures that were supposed to hold would hold under stress. That's still how I think. I don't escalate unless I have to. But there is a meaningful difference between keeping the peace and accepting terms that were never fair to begin with. Those are not the same thing. I wish I had understood that sooner. If you are a grandparent and someone is placing conditions on your access to your grandchild, know this. Every state in the country has some form of grandparent visitation law. The threshold and the process vary, but the right exists in some form nearly everywhere. Find a family law attorney in your state and ask specifically about grandparent visitation rights. Don't assume you have no options. I assumed that, for longer than I should have. And if you are giving money to family, and I understand why people do, and I would give it again, document it. A simple letter signed by both parties, stating the amount, the purpose, and whether it is a gift or a loan. It takes 20 minutes and costs almost nothing. It protects the relationship as much as it protects you, because it removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where certain kinds of arrangements take hold. I learned that the expensive way. I'm telling you so you don't have to. Last month, Jonah turned 5. I drove up to Nashville the morning of his birthday with a kite, blue and red, a big delta wing, the kind that practically flies itself. We went to Centennial Park while Adrian made breakfast at home, and the wind off the reservoir caught it on the first try, and Jonah ran in circles on the grass, holding the string with both hands, laughing his full-body laugh, yelling into the open sky about how high it was going, about how it could probably reach the clouds. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, and I watched him, and I thought about Carol. She would have been completely undone by that moment. She would have cried and denied crying, and taken 40 pictures, and called her sister from the parking lot on the way home. She would have talked about it for weeks. I took 3 photos, one for myself, one for Adrian, and one that I put in the frame on the windowsill in my kitchen, right next to the one of Carol holding Jonah in the hospital the week he was born, her face doing the thing faces do when something is too big for them to contain. She would have loved that kite. I like to think she saw it anyway.